Hi, Misha here, and this is actually a Czech Vz.52, one of the earlier D Technics, still with the extended muzzle nut on. Actually came in the store and ended up hanging on to it because it reminded me of my very first Vz.58. But this video is not about this gun. As much as we like Czech guns around here, it'll be for another day. After all, we did a appreciation video on the 58 7.62 by 39 caliber gun, packing peanut, quite recently. No, this video is on its grandfather, father, and more importantly, this video was requested by a channel supporter. As you may know, the guys up at Phoenix Ammo have made a couple of donations to the channel, ammo donations, just for us to use in videos because ammo has become hard to get and too expensive. This is not a sponsorship. We don't have a code. They don't ask for anything in return. However, Kyle over there, in literally a handwritten letter mailed to us, just said offhand it would be cool if we eventually revisited this gun, the Czechoslovakian Vz.52 57 specifically. And while we've covered this gun a number of times on the channel, it has been a minute, and again, it's a very small request and a gun that I do like bringing out, although we're not going to shoot it, and I'll explain why later, unless the guys over at Phoenix end up eventually offering 7.62 by 39, and then, okay, then we will. But I do have my reasons for kind of retiring this from the shooter rack, at least unless a special occasion comes along. So this video is requested by Kyle, and we're going to dive in, just, some stuff. It's pretty out, but cold. But we've been having quite a winter around here, which is kind of, suiting for a Czech gun, don't you think? And you know me, before we can really talk about what makes the 52, 57 special, and maybe some of its detractions, we got to get into the history. It's very important with this gun, especially the political history. But if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, hey, go over to Patreon. With no further ado, let's go back to the end of the Great War, the war to end all wars that, well, that didn't work out so hot now, did it? Czechoslovakia, as we knew it once, was born out of that war in 1918, after the whole German thing and kind of rearranging Europe. And one thing that the Czechs obtained as part of kind of war reparations and breaking apart the Imperial German military was the old Mauser factory in Skoda, including a lot of the old tooling for the Gewehr 98 and so on. So they started making the Vzor 98, VZ Vzor, and that was basically just model in Czech. Very quickly, they would start innovating. The Vzor 9822 would be essentially a slightly updated Gewehr 98, and then there'd be the Vz.23, their first attempt at a carbine. And they would originally do like a 21.5-inch barrel, but very soon they would go to this length, the kind of intermediate, with about a 23.25-inch barrel, becoming the Vz.24, and this was wildly successful. In fact, while the factory at Brno was originally state-owned, in 1924 or thereabouts, it was privatized so that they could easily sell international. And while the interwar period wasn't exactly a booming time for the arms industry, this was one of the few guns that actually received a lot of success, because intermediate Mauser, this is an 8mm, this is one of the Romanian contracts. Romania got like 500,000 of these. Yeah, this was just a good size, so much so that the Germans copied it for the Kar 98K. Now, they'll say they had their own program at Mauser, and assume they're here or there, but the Czechs were kind of leading the way. And of course, they would ultimately design what the British would use as the Bren light machine gun, so they're getting quite the industry going. And they're well respected. And you basically have the two companies. You have Bruno, which goes by CB, and you have the Strakonis factory, which is CZ. They would kind of compete back and forth. Of course, the Germans would come back in 1938. You'd have that whole thing, and the Czechs would fall under their sway even before the war really got going. But they would keep making Vz.24s under the Germans, and then eventually switching over to the Kar 98. And eventually, a lot of German gear would be made in occupied Czechoslovakia. P-38s, you see a lot of MP-44s down there, of course, regular K-98s. It influenced things. And the Czechs weren't exactly willing participants in the Third Reich, but they didn't really have a lot of choice, even though they had a very good arms industry, and the Germans definitely took advantage of that. And this is just an example. Like I said, this is a Romanian contract. Romania was part of the Axis until 1944. And of course, Czechoslovakia was, air quotes, liberated by the Red Army, the Russians, the Soviets, the Communists, towards the end of the war in 1945. And that would lead to the post-war events that get us to today's featured rifle. Immediately following the war, while the Communists held sway in Czechoslovakia, they didn't have that iron grip yet. So they were nominally independent and really proud of that. And that's where this rifle begins. Not the Vz.52-57 quite yet, but the Vz.52. In the summer of 1946, the Army General Staff kind of outlined a general plan for the Czech Army going forward. And they wanted a new issue rifle. Up to this point, they were, had a lot of Mausers, K98s, Vz24s. They had some German Gewehr 43s. And they had some Mosin Nagants that had kind of made their way into the country. And they had some MP44s and even some older versions like the MP43 and even some of the MKB42 kind of early prototype type guns. Just, again, Czechoslovakia, part of the Third Reich. All this going on and more. And the requirements were pretty stringent, something we'll see going forward with the Vz.58. The new rifle needed to be self-loading, automatic, have a 5 or 10 round mag. It needed to be pretty lightweight, under 9 pounds. The less is better. But it needed to have the same accuracy as the Mauser, like a Vz.24. Essentially use it as a DMR if possible. Now, they decided early on that a full power cartridge, like 8mm, just wouldn't do, 8x57. But intermediate, maybe that's a good idea. Now, they weren't really looking at the Soviet 7.6239 yet. At this period, that's not a well-known cartridge. In fact, it's really not even in service, except testing. But the 7.9233 8mm Kurs from the MP44 sure is. At the very end of 1946, it's convinced by researchers, scientists, those in the know, gun guys, that let's allow intermediate cartridges for these trials. Cool. So the Czechs don't just copy. They start making their own cartridges in 47, and the first one is known as 7.5. They kind of like that 7.5mm diameter, 55. And it was known as the Z47 cartridge. Well, things do change in 48. The communists really start gaining full control over the government. But progress moves forward, and you get the Z49 cartridge, which is a scaled back to 7.545, which is getting really similar to what this gun fires. But with the communist influence, and I think just standardization of 30 caliber bores, next we get the Z50 cartridge, and that's what we have here. It is 7.62 by 45. Now that we're getting the cartridge situation ironed out, it's time to actually pick the rifle. And both CB, Bruno, and CZ, the Strakonis factory, submitted designs. And the one from CZ, well, the lead designer was Jan Kratovich, and he'll go along with his brother to make a few other designs of note in Czechoslovakia. And quite early on, the submission from CZ, known as the CZ493, that basically just means the factory, and then the year 1949, and then the third developmental submission, was an early favorite. And basically, the one from Bruno, I don't know really if it went much of anywhere. But they needed some changes. It was doing well in trials, but it had a spike bayonet. Let's go to a blade. And the breech block system, which is pretty unique in this gun, all things considered, they needed a little more revision. Also, we need a cleaning kit for our soldiers. So let's put one in the butt plate, or butt stock, I should say. And a few little details like that, not to mention updating it for the Z50 cartridge, would result in the CZ502 trials gun, which was, of course, 1950, second submission. And this would actually be field tested. It was given to a couple of regiments in early 1951 to, see what they thought. And what they thought was it was plenty reliable, dependable, well made enough. They said, when it comes to accuracy, it rivals the Vz.54 at, 500, 600 meters. A good marksman can get it out to 800. The only thing is, it's not going to be a marksman, or sniper gun, I should say. So that part isn't there. Also, it's a tad bit heavy. So even though this is clearly going to be the new gun, they want a few changes, including lightening the bayonet assembly, which is what we end up with here. Also, they wanted to tweak the gas regulator, gas system, just a little bit. And a few other small things to streamline production. And of course, Strakonis did this, and so the gun was officially accepted as the SA Vz.52 in March of 1952. And the first couple of years of production were relatively limited. In fact, as the CZ factory proper, they only made about 6,000, because in 1954, communism really got its claws in good. In Constructa Bruno, basically everything became not just state-owned, ran, but consolidated into one just big conglomerate. Basically, a state-enforced monopoly. Bruno, Strakonis, all rolled into one, plus other things. And so 1954 is when these go into major production. Czechoslovakia was really the only Warsaw Pact nation, Warsaw Pact came in 1955, that didn't issue the Kalashnikov in some form and did their own thing. That would be the Vz.58. That was a bit of an allowance by the communists who really wanted tight control. But they drew their line at that completely weird and unique 7.62 by 45 cartridge. In fact, the only two guns that were ever put into production that fired it were the Vz.52 rifle, Carbine, and the Vz.52 light machine gun. Now, would more come later? Maybe, as we'll see in a bit in the video. It was a really good cartridge. But no. The Czechs, they can do their own rifle thing, I guess. But they're going to have to standardize on the 7.62 by 39 round. This is specified in 54. But why is this a 52, 57? Why did it take so long? Why did they build the 52 for a few more years? Well, it actually took the Russians quite some time to get the specifications for 7.62 39, the cartridge, to the Czechs. In fact, it wasn't until 1956 that they were able to start really producing the cartridge en masse in country. This is why the prototypes for the Vz.58 were in the 7.62 45 caliber. That would have been an interesting alternative thing. But with the cartridge there, excuses couldn't be made anymore. And so it was pretty much a done deal at the Constructa Bruno conglomerate that the Vz.52 would be replaced by the Vz.52-57, which is chambered for 7.62 by 39 M43. And at first you might think this is, you know, just a straightforward rebarreling. Even they might have rechambered some older 52s. But that's not the truth. The guns are actually a lot more different than you might first think. The rifle is under 40 inches tip to tip and has a 20.5-inch barrel. And after we made a few changes, including the lightweight bayonet, the overall mass of the original 52 was just over 9.1 pounds. Not quite the target they had, but really close. With this bayonet deployed, you have a reach of about 47 inches. It essentially adds 8 inches. The bayonet itself is about 10.5, and it is very light. As I said, the original prototype had a spike. They went to the blade for government-requested reasons. It's okay. I mean, it folds up well. It's got that cool cutout in the stock, although it's not the strongest in the world. Another fun thing, this is threaded, although it was really only for a blank fire device. They never did like a flash hider. And it's actually retained, if I can show you, by the front sight protector, that little right there. That's pretty neat, I think. And it feeds from the detaching and proprietary 10-round mags made of steel. Now they do have an automatic hold open, as you've seen. You can put your finger in here and trip it. Like so. There's no release, you just pull it out. There you go. Reciprocating charging handle. And this breech system they use, as I mentioned earlier, is pretty unique. It's a tilting tipping bolt, but it tips and locks in the front near the chamber, right behind it in fact, versus in the back like on most guns. And we have a skinny but long recoil spring in the back. Stock with a semi-pistol grip. And the trigger group is interesting. It's actually inspired, if not exactly a direct copy, close, of the M1 Garand. And then we have the butt plate, as I mentioned earlier, that stows your cleaning kit. And it's interesting because we have an inner butt plate and an outer butt plate. You can kind of tell because it's a little bit ad hoc. It works fine, but you can tell it was kind of added to the design later because they don't have a full featured trap door. It's, you know, hey, pull your butt plate off and there it is. It works, but yeah. The rifle has a phosphate finish, and stock's wood was made out of walnut or beech. And the bore was not chrome lined, and the rear sight was graduated out to 1,000 meters, which was actually optimistic, but the 7.62 45 cartridge could do it. I will say too, one of the design changes in the prototype they did was improving the trigger, and it's noticeable. This is actually a pretty good feeling trigger. Finally, we have a Grand style safety here. Can't activate it when it's not cocked, but easy enough to do when cocked. Again, really good trigger on this gun. And a side mounted sling, essentially the exact same pattern later featured on the Vz.58 if we're being honest with each other. And we'll look at the gas system internally here in a little bit. And again, here's the mag. And this mag is unique to the Vz.52. So now let's talk about the 52, 57's differences. As I said, there are more than you might first realize. But since we left off with the mag on the 52, let's start off with the mag on the 57. It may look the same at first, but if you compare the bottom, the base plates, you'll notice this has much more of a taper. That's for the 7.6239 cartridge, shorter, stubbier, compared with the 52s. For what it's worth, 2 mags were issued per gun, one to be kept in the gun, one kept in a single cell kind of pebble grain leather pouch on the belt. One difference that might be more apparent looking at it, this went from a phosphate finish to kind of a baked on lacquer finish for the metal parts. And this would actually be used in an updated form on the Vz.58. And while the storage compartment and the stock is the same, the cleaning kit was altered for the new cartridge. The system inside here, while it has a slightly different power spring, it works the same. Now the gas block / regulator was updated for the different power of 39. You'll see little vents on this one. But more importantly, the barrel is quite different. Still a 20.5 inch, but it's chrome lined. Again, something used on the Vz.58. And this is why the idea of 52s just being converted over doesn't really hold water. The 52 barrel is screwed in, very traditional style. The 52-57 is pinned in. Again, something featured on the Vz.58. You can kind of tell they're working out technologies there. And it also speeds up production and eases head spacing. That's why if you see some gun, Vz.52, marked as Vz.52-57, and it's not a pinned barrel, be very wary, because a lot of people have bought little chamber spacers where they can shoot X39 out of a 52, but yeah. Another way to tell, as I said a minute ago, the 52's rear sight was graduated to 1,000 meters. The 52-57's is 900. That's because they knew this was not as flat shooting and long ranged of a cartridge. The muzzle velocity of the 45 cartridge was about 760, 765 meters per second. Well, with the X39 cartridge, at least the one the Czechs had, you're looking at 730, 735 meters per second. So a noticeable decrease, not to mention just the aerodynamics aren't as good. So they knew this was really only going to be effective in manuals out to about 400 meters average, maybe 600 with a good marksman. They knew that this was an inferior cartridge. It was a little lighter, to be sure, but they were essentially forced to comply with the Warsaw Pact. That's just how things were. And if they didn't comply, well, look what happened in Prague. Yeah, they didn't have a lot of choice. By 1957, this was in production, and these would be built until 1959. That's because the 52-57 was always an interim solution until the Vz.58 was ready to go. So, yeah. And that, I guess, gets us into their military history, which is more interesting than you might realize, partially because of the Soviets using Czechoslovakia as a weapons proxy. The Vz.52 was definitely meant to be a frontline weapon, and that's why they put a lot of effort in developing it and its cartridge. And to be fair, not many nations in the late 40s, early 50s used self-loading rifles, especially small nations, much less designed their own, again, with its own cartridge from scratch. But the whole communist stuff, yeah. And so primary production was between 54 and 56, and they built around 150,000. And they would only stay in frontline Czech service through the late 50s. Because by that point, 7.62-45 was no longer the primary service cartridge in that nation, much to their chagrin. So, yeah. Now, they would hang on in a certain area, you know, backwater, militia areas, second line reserve, guard guns. You see a lot of, like, building guards, that kind of thing, and parades. The bayonet was pretty sharp looking in a parade. The gun definitely was more aesthetically appealing for parades than the later ones. And they would even do some nickel or chrome ones, whatever they were, you know, nice shiny silver ones. But yeah, they didn't make it in Czechoslovakia much past the 50s. As for the 52-57 here, it was always an interim thing, as I just said. So they weren't, this really wasn't what they wanted, but the 58 wasn't quite ready yet. Okay, fine. At least it fired what was then the standard cartridge, so it would hang on in front line and reserve a little longer, certainly through the mid to late 60s in Czechoslovakia. And during its little over 2-year production run, they would build roughly 100,000. No one knows. We're just kind of estimating based on serial ranges and blocks and everything else. But because these were in a standard cartridge, they would stay within Czechoslovakia longer than the 52s. Remember how I said the Soviets would get involved? Well, backtracking, even though the career within Czechoslovakia wasn't all that great, Russia didn't want to always sell guns or broker deals themselves directly. In 1954, they essentially set up Czechoslovakia and Egypt on a blind date. And this would result in lots of weapons, either from the Czechs or flowing through the Czechs going to Egypt, including Vz.52s along with their ammunition. They're one of the first nations to really get these, along with their cartridge. Now, did they get 52-57s? Maybe, but evidence of that's a little shaky. Our next really user of note would come in 1959 with good old Fidel Castro. That's a story for another day, but the Czechs sold, donated, gave, whatever, quite a large number of Vz.52s to Cuba. I don't believe many 52-57s got there, if any at all. And we don't know how many, but we know it was in the 6 digits or nearabouts. Probably the bulk of them went there, frankly, because there is a record of nearly 400,000 spare magazines being ordered from the Czechs by Cuba around 1961. So, considering that they only issued 1 or 2 mags per gun, their chances are the Cubans didn't issue more, meaning that, you know, maybe 4 mags per gun. We don't really know for sure. And of course, spares. Also, that same year, these appeared at the Bay of Pigs. The Cubans used these to defend against that whole thing there. Look, I'm as pro-American as anyone and was raised to not think well of communism, but the Bay of Pigs was ill-advised. And these would stay in pretty much frontline Cuban service up into the early 80s, and reserve service even after. In fact, usually when you think of a Vz.52, Cuba comes to mind. But, either directly through the Czechs or maybe a third party, quite a few of these made their way into Africa and a few spots in Asia. In fact, a number were spotted in Vietnam. Probably not a huge number, but yeah, the Vz.52 was used in Vietnam. That's pretty cool. As to the 52-57, this is where we get to Grenada. When U.S. soldiers went there in that brief little conflict, several of these were brought back. 52s and also 52-57s, including this one. And the Grenadines didn't have a ton, maybe a couple of thousand, but they were used there. And this was one of the last times soldiers were officially allowed to bring back a gun. And this was a good candidate for all the paperwork for a trophy, because it is a semi-automatic only, always has been, always will be, 10-round mag. By the time of Desert Storm in 91, they were a lot more restrictive, and by the time of the 21st century, it was virtually impossible to bring a gun back from Iraq or Afghanistan. But yeah, when guys marched these home in the 80s, it was a weird one. And that's where most of your Vz.52, 57s in America seem to have come from. Although I believe there was a small batch that Century Arms imported a long time ago. When I say small, I mean well under 1,000. But the Vz.52, that's a different story. Cuba would export quite a few tens of thousands to places in South America. And picking these up and switching them around, I can definitely tell this is a lighter gun. But eventually they would kind of go through their service in those areas and be imported into America by Century, maybe someone else, in relatively large numbers. In fact, there are still some on the market today. I believe Iowa had some. They pop up. Like I said, they were in Africa too. The limiting factor here is still the cartridge, 7.62 by 45. The good news is Century actually imported crates of that ammo. The bad news is it was stored in containers which were lashed to the decks of ships, and a lot of it got wet. So between age and moisture, a lot of the surplus ammo was less than ideal. However, good news again, we finally do have some modern production 7.62 by 45. It's not cheap, but it does exist. And the Vz.52 gets me to a little story time on my own. I've told it before, but it's also kind of part of this history. Eons ago, when I was still very much getting into guns, I had recently purchased a Vz.52 pistol. Very inexpensive back in the day. One of my first Tokarev top guns. I went into the same shop some time later, and they had what I knew it wasn't an SKS, but it reminded me of an FKS. It looked like this, except instead of a nice wood stock, it had a black stock with this pebble grain finish. That's weird. Ask them what it was. Vz.52. I thought that was a pistol. It's also a rifle. I learned later there's also that light machine gun. They like that year. Well, I bought it. It was inexpensive. I think it was right at $100. And they actually had the ammunition. No spare mags, but they had the ammo. You got it in little 5-round stripper clips. And because this was a non-chrome line bore, and because the ammo was less than not corrosive, a lot of these did have sewer pipes. Which also explains why a lot of them had that weird truck bed liner on the stock. At first I didn't know it was an original, but I would soon find out it was. Yeah, Century Arms did that to some that they brought over, I believe from South America, where the stocks were dried out, cracking, coming apart. Well, let's put truck bed liner on them to refinish them. Great, guys. So they did that. A few people did try to strip it off. It didn't go well. I think they reported it left kind of a greenish hue on the stocks. Luckily, this one's got a nice, attractive stock, which is why I ended up hanging on to it. And with that, let's go to the table and talk about some of the design features, because I think that's where we get into the pros and cons of this. And it also explains why I'm not just super thrilled to fire these today. Here at the table, overall length is the same, under 40 inches, and both have a 20.5 inch barrel. Now, when it comes to the stocks, like I said, walnut and beech, but I don't know it's directly that one used the other. I mean, kind of the rule of thumb is you typically see the 52s with the walnut and the 52, 57s with the beech, but I don't know how how much that was really enforced and true. It seems like they just kind of used what they had within reason. I mention that because there is a difference in weight. This is about 9.1 pounds. And this is about 9.5. And that's not just Wikipedia. While doing this video, moving them around, the 57 is noticeably, although not egregiously, heavier. Looking up close externally, as I said, the originals had phosphated parts, although I won't swear that maybe some during a refurb would not get paint. And likewise, while the 57s had the lacquer paint, I wouldn't swear that maybe some small parts or whatever would not remain phosphated or maybe be swapped out. Things happen. The rear sight is an easy tell. 1,000 meters. 900. But yeah, the pinned barrel, you can easily see the pin on either side versus not having that area there. That's the major difference. An easy way to tell. Magazines, but they are interchangeable. Although if you have a mag meant for 45 and try to run it in 39, I don't know about reliability. And obviously this mag is too short for that, but you can swap them back and forth. So, be aware of that. Just wanted to kind of point that out. Both use the same type of bayonet. Like I said, the gas block is slightly altered with these vent cuts. Same front sight protector and, muzzle there. The mechanics. Let's begin with the trigger pack. This is derived by the M1 Garand, at least mostly. You pull the trigger guard back and it pulls out of the stock. You kind of slide it forward and fiddle it back. It's okay. But yeah, very much an M1 Garand style trigger group. Although, to be fair to the French, Garand himself actually borrowed that from the MLE 1917. But what about the operating system? It uses a very interesting system, which part I find easy to get to, and part I find difficult. So, let's take a look. Getting to the gas piston is quite easy. There's a tab on each side of the handguard. You just squeeze and lift off. The metal and wood come off together, and then here you go. It's actually an annular piston that goes around the barrel and comes back here. Basically, it is a pair of forks that come out and hit the carrier. And you can take it out of the stock, just like on an M1 Garand. And this bayonet assembly actually has a spring-loaded button onto the other side to slide it off, at least towards, so you can get the band. That part I really like. It's very innovative. However, the bolt group, I'm not as much of a fan of this. You can see here where the bolt locks in the front. Now, there's no manual release for the automatic last round hold open. You just have to take your mag out. And so it is an interesting bolt system. Even a spring-loaded firing pin. And honestly, taking it apart is not that hard. You just slide this back and take it out of the groove. The problem I have, at least, is getting it back together successfully without crimping anything. The recoil spring is very skinny and very long, and just seems like a lot of the times when I try to put it back in, it wants to kind of back on itself. And I don't feel like doing it. Again, taking it apart's pretty easy. I'm sure with a lot of practice, soldiers got good at it. But, meh. And I do want to point out something. This gun was considered easy enough to disassemble and reliable enough in the field. However, it did have 1 or 2 failure points. As you can tell, disassembly was pretty straightforward, and cleaning of this annular piston was okay, but by the standards of the 50s, it's not as simple as, say, with the SKS or Kalashnikov. But to me, the big detraction is the firing pin. As with the 52 pistol, this is a very long, skinny pin, and it has a cut in the back where it gets very skinny. That area is there so that the firing pin and spring get retained in the bolt carrier, but I've had one break on me before, and I had one break on a friend before, so I'm sure it wasn't a super common deal, but I do try to not dry fire these more than I have to, and I just don't often shoot them because parts wear out, things happen, I don't know. And again, the ammo isn't super common anyway. The mags are kind of an interesting blend of rock and lock and straight in insert. But since they were only issuing 2 per rifle, you were expected to top them off with stripper clips. The extra mag was really this there for a spare in case yours got lost, damaged, or you got in an intense firefight. The Vz.52 definitely resembles more of an automatic loading rifle from the 1930s or 40s. And that's not a bad thing, but by the 50s, technology is progressing. The 57 shows a few modernizations, the pinned barrel, the more paint finish, the chrome lime bore. And of course, the 58 keeps it on, and the AKM from there. Everything is a relic of its time, and these rifles just happen to be developed and put into production when technology was changing an awful lot. The FN-49 was a good gun, but it was obsolete very quickly, and the French definitely hung on to the MAS 49-56 longer than they probably should have. But of course, by the late 50s, other nations were switching over, and therefore this gun's days were numbered. It was also started to be considered rather time-consuming, costly, labor-intensive to produce by that era as well. But what do you think? You know, the designs that the brothers Kratochvil had in Czechoslovakia were unique, innovative, and often overly complicated, and had some fragile parts. Firing pins, not just of the rifles, but of the 52 pistols, were a thing. I really appreciate them for mechanical, and you could see a lot of inspiration from German designs, MG42, MKB42, and so on and so forth. But no, it was with the Vz.58 here that Constructa really hit gold. You know, they produced around 250,000 Vz.52 and 52-57s together. And they stayed in Czech service relatively briefly. And other nations would take them, and some really even liked them, like Cuba. But for the most part, it was just a filler. But you gotta give props for them doing their own thing. But with this gun, they continue to do their own thing, and I think with the experience of the 1950s and designing, they got it right. I'm not saying this is a perfect gun, but it's pretty close. And that's why it was in production for 25 years, and they built just shy of 1 million, and it was in military service past communism for over half a century. Both Czech Republic and Slovakia kept it in. That's again a story for another day. I had to mention it here because a lot of the technology we first see in the 52 series is carried over to this gun. And if you don't know, we have lots of videos on this channel about it. As for the original Vz.52, as I said, my history with this model of gun goes back 25 years itself. And I do like them. They are a lot of fun to shoot, and the 7.62 45 cartridge is very pleasant, very flat shooting. It's just unfortunate that it has been and will continue to be rare. It was a good idea, but a lot of good idea cartridges, not just in the communist bloc, but also in the West, I'm thinking of you, 280 British, kind of got quashed in the name of standardization. Oh well. But it's a cool gun, but they don't bring a whole lot because, well, special parts and time running out, and the newer ones imported seem to be pretty rough. So when Kyle asked me to do a update video on the 52, 57 specifically, while I had to, of course, mention the others, I was happy to do it. Why not? This was actually one of my early kind of whale guns that it took me a good long time to find. I've had this one a long time now, but it seemed like it took me so very long to find them because there are just not that many in America. Several hundred, maybe 1,000, maybe a few more now. Again, they made 100,000, but so many of them never kind of got the circulation like the 52s. For whatever reason, they're just not as common. Heck, for all I know, there's still 50,000 sitting in a stockpile in the Czech Republic. Yeah. But yeah, it's just an uncommon gun for now. And they do shoot well, but I can't say they shoot remarkably different. They're heavier than some things. Trigger's okay, better than SKS. I'd say it's a little bit more flat shooting than one, but not outstanding and remarkable. This was just more the Czechs trying to do their own thing, still remain as independent from the communists as they could, and I applaud them for that. And they continued through today with the 805 Bren and Bren 2. So yeah, thanks Kyle for kind of requesting this video. And if you'd like to request a video, I'm always open to it for Patreons. Go over there, happy to do it. And if you can't do that, you know, liking, sharing, subscribing, maybe making a one-time super thanks donation on YouTube, those are all cool too. But if you can't donate money, I get it, but come on, click the like button. That's easy enough. Yeah. If you get a chance to ever mess with these, I encourage you to do it. Neat part of Cold War history, and I really do love the Cuban connection with the 52. Let me know what you think. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.